Coming in at number 5, we've got From Hell, an eerily illustrated tale of Jack the Ripper written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Eddie Campbell. What else could you ask for? From Hell is the story of the world's most famous serial killer and the events that caused such speculation around the murders. The story kicks off during the Whitechapel murders of the late Victorian era. Moore blends history with educated speculation in order to weave a terrifying tale of royal cover-ups, Freemason visions, and brutal violence. While From Hell does cover plenty of real events, it also serves as a character study of a high-ranking Freemason, Gull. He's employed by the royal family to cover up a scandalous matter and ends up going a little mad with power. After realizing that a group of prostitutes was aware of a baby with royal connections, he and a carriage driver enact a vicious campaign of violence against them. For those familiar with the Whitechapel murders, this will sound a little familiar. It even includes the origin of the famous From Hell letter, which made Jack the Ripper a household name at the time. Even beyond the business aspects of his murder, Gull envisions a future long after his violent acts are done. He sees a world where masculinity has totally dominated femininity, supposedly thanks to his reign of terror. He even manages to see the work he's inspired through visions like copycat killers and morbid artists interested in serial killers. While not totally historically accurate, From Hell is a fascinating read with plenty of insight into the Whitechapel murders and Jack the Ripper himself. The black and white art is often grim and grisly and accentuates the tale well. If you're wondering if it's gruesome enough for you, just know that it was banned in Australia for weeks after some customs officers seized copies headed to Quality Comics. If it's getting banned in Australia, you know there's some good stuff in there.
Swinging in at number 4, Hellboy. I mean, John Constantine aside, there isn't really a more iconic horror demon leading man than Big Red himself, Hellboy. And also, as a side note, Ron Perlman is the only cinematic Hellboy ever. Although, I think we should all give fair chance to David Harbour because that guy is dope. Created by the legendary Mike Mignola, Hellboy is perhaps one of the most notoriously awesome horror creations in fiction, and much like Hellblazer carved the path through alternative storytelling by literally littering the way with more evil Nazi occultists, 11th hour rituals, and murderous clockwork killers than you can shake a pitchfork at. You know what was so awesome about Hellboy though? He's the literal definition of an anti-hero. He's the son of the demonic Duke Azael, and despite that, he's also the personification of being a damn good dude. Also, his real name is Anung Unrama, which means and upon his brow is set a crown of flame. How cool is that? The Hellboy series ran from 1993 all the way up to 2016 in one of the most captivatingly original displays of Lovecraftian horror, badass one-liners, and tear-jerking moments of family and brotherhood. Next up at number 3, Sandman. Alright, you might be thinking, come on Jack, Sandman isn't really scary, and while in some ways I tend to agree, but the matter of fact is that Sandman is one of the most uniquely original horror titles in graphic literature, and more than anything, I appreciate originality. Also, it's Neil Gaiman. Come on. Time and time again, Sandman continues to be a genre in and of itself, blending fantasy, magical realism, and psychological horror into a neat, terrifying, and cerebral package. The Sandman series, again published by Vertigo via DC Comics, focuses on the main character of Dream, also known as Morpheus, and many other mythological names. It tiptoes its way across such a broad church that it's oftentimes so easy to get lost in its narrative, and I mean that in a good way, blending eternal concepts of religion, mythology, and folklore through a stream of terrifying consciousness. When the series first began in 1989, Neil Gaiman was just another British upstart trying to make his way in fiction, but when it ended in 1996, everyone just kind of held up their hands in awe and said, okay, alright, who the hell is this dude? Listen, Sandman isn't exactly full frontal horror, but when it pulls the scares, it pulls them like no other. Coming in at number 2, Swamp Thing. We can't really make a horror comic book list without putting Swamp Thing on it. There are laws to these things, you know, and I don't want to break them. With the more modern incarnation of old Swampy, who is all round probably the most decent dude in comic book history, it may be easy to forget that the origins of Swamp Thing literally form the basis for contemporary horror. And we have one man to thank for that, the legendary Englishman and perhaps the greatest graphic novel writer in history, Alan Moore. Before that though, Swamp Thing already had incredible horror pedigree with its creators Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson, who creeped onto the canvas in a horrifying display of creature feature body horror, sticking on the fringes of comic book fandom whilst developing a hardy cult following. The thing is though, when Alan Moore took control of Our Boy Swampy back in the 80s, vegetable matter was never the same again, and horror fiction was battered by some of the most horrific scenes ever inked. With each page, Alan Moore took us deeper and deeper into the horrors of the swamp, in grotesque displays of death and resurrection, and the fierce, eternal struggle of creation. He gave us the Parliament of Trees and the Green, the Floronic Man, and of course, John Constantine himself, all the while penning some of the greatest literary horror moments of the 20th century. And finally, our number one spot, Tales from the Crypt. There is perhaps one literary graphic showstopper that modern horror owes all of its creation to, even shows the likes of The Twilight Zone, Black Mirror, even True Detective, which wouldn't be the fictional works that they are without the horror granddaddy of them all, Tales from the Crypt. Although there are several precursors, one comic book series ruled the roost of horror way back when in the first half of the 1950s. EC Comics, the otherwise unknown publishers of The Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, and of course Tales from the Crypt, the bi-monthly anthology series that delivered some of the most excruciatingly horrifying tales of all time. Although their reign was short, running only between 1950 and 1954 before, the censorship board had a thing or two to say about the nature of their content, the Crypt Keeper, alongside the Vault Keeper and the Old Witch, swiftly became some of the most iconic figures in horror history. Horror hosts the world over wouldn't be the horror hosts that they are without these mysterious, terrifying, hooded figures first carving their way through modern entertainment and popular culture. Tales from the Crypt had one intention, and it delivered that in pits and spades. Scare the living daylight out of us, and it did.
Coming in at number 5, Lock and Key. Lock and Key is an American comic book series written by Joe Hill and illustrated by Gabriel Rodriguez, and published by IDW Publishing. The plot is presented in non-chronological order. During the American Revolution, a group of rebels hiding beneath the future Key House discover a portal to another dimension, the plains of Leng, filled with demons who can mesmerize anyone that sees them and possesses them through touch. However, when demons attempt to enter the real world, they collapse into lumps of whispering iron, which young smith Benjamin Locke forges into a variety of magical keys, including the Omega Key, which seals the entrance to the dimension. The magic of the Key House gradually evolves over the years, including a spell which causes occupants to forget about the keys and the magic of the house when they pass their 18th birthday. The narrative of Lock and Key is structured in 3 acts. Each act consists of 2 storylines of 6 monthly issues. Act 1 story arc, Welcome to Lovecraft, was a 6-issue limited series published by IDW Publishing. The series was adapted into a film trilogy which was officially announced at the 2014 Comic-Con. However, in October 2015, Joe Hill confirmed that the films are no longer happening. However, he stated that a TV series is still possible. In May 2016, Joe Hill announced he would write a TV pilot, serve as executive producer, and pitch the show to various networks. And it worked.
Coming in at number 4, we've got Harrow County. Now, for something totally different, we have a beautifully rendered tale of reincarnated witches and sentient skin. Oh yeah. Written and illustrated by Cullen Bunn and Tyler Crook, Harrow County is a fascinating little number full of gorgeous, if not horrifying monsters, or haints as they like to call them. Each haint, while monstrous, seems to have a personality that's brought out by Emmy, the reincarnation of witch Hester Beck. All done up in gorgeous watercolors, this is a world full of secrets just waiting to be discovered. Most of these haints will remain hidden until they want to be seen, and some are smarter than others. They might greet you head on and try to make use of you for their own purposes. The monsters you'll get to know the best, though, are from the family. See, the world of Harrow County goes back, way back. Famous witches and warlocks and other magical beings have been reincarnated for ages, with each new iteration taking over the tasks performed by the last. They all feel duty-bound to continue their work, sometimes leading them to act ruthlessly and crudely. Oh, and the way they gain more power is pretty filthy, so maybe don't head in on a full stomach. If you like varied monsters, vile prophecies, and southern fried accents, give Harrow County a read. There's a big omnibus coming in the new year, so if you can wait till then, you might save a little cash too. Coming in at number 3, we've got witches. We've got some more witches in store for you, but these are a little different. Writer Scott Snyder pens a fascinating portrait of these supernatural creatures. They're not the green-skinned, pointy hat-wearing cat lovers we're all familiar with. They don't turn people to newts expecting that they'll get better. No, these are witches with a Y. Much worse, much more sinister. These witches wait deep in the woods and let the desires deep in people's hearts bring tributes and victims to their doorstep. This series focuses on the Rook family and their missteps. After their daughter Sailor was aggressively bullied, the bully mysteriously disappeared. This led to plenty of rumors and forced the Rooks to leave town and start fresh. However, some of the little birdies followed them, making the adjustment even more difficult. And if that wasn't bad enough, the Rooks have pretty much no idea about the supernatural secrets the town is hiding. Beneath the forest dwells a society of witches, beings who the locals sacrifice people to in exchange for priceless boons. If you smear someone with green goop and ask for something in exchange, the witches will snatch up the pledge and grant your wish. This leads to some terrible betrayals of trust and horrific reveals. The illustrations by Jock of Batman and Wolverine fame are striking and accentuate the dark story well. If you weren't afraid of the woods before, you will be after reading this. Coming in at number 2, we've got Black Hole. Some might describe this one as It Follows by way of David Cronenberg, written and illustrated by Charles Burns. If that doesn't sell you on Black Hole immediately, I don't know what to say. Set in the 70s, Black Hole is a look at the lives of some suburban Seattleite teenagers. Good start for any horror media, but just you wait. It gets better. There's a disease that swept through town, which affects the youth more than anyone else. It's transmitted between victims through sexual contact and manifests in unexpected and disgusting ways. Often there are horrifying disfigurements that happen as a result. Some can be effectively hidden and some are unavoidable. But once you get it, you'll always have it. Permanent body horror. After meeting the main characters, you would expect that some sort of plague battle would occur. However, we are treated to a different story. We instead get a portrait of American high school life. Cliques, cruelty, alienation, uncertainty, and more. That's the real horror, right? Well, it is until the murders begin. As teens who catch this disease run away from home and to an encampment full of people like them, strange things start happening. Some folks are less friendly than others, to say the least. The illustrations are black and white, adding to the eerie, surreal feeling of the story. Many of the characters kind of look unsettling before their mutations even take place, and once the disfigurements appear, they become genuinely horrible to behold. And finally, at number 1, we've got Beautiful Darkness. Oh man, this one will take you on a wild ride. I don't want to spoil too much, but I feel like I have to set it up a little. Beautiful Darkness begins like a fairy tale, which actually should tell you quite a bit right away. A race of tiny people the size of fruit flies must leave their home and survive in the woods. They're led by Aurora, a kind and sweet girl who's thrust into action. At first, the tale is fun and cute and sort of carefree. The art is definitely cute and colorful, and all the characters seem to be whimsical, if not inconsequential. This changes pretty quickly though. It can be read as a tale concerning how quickly people can revert to base survival instinct and what it means to be human. Now that they've been sent out, they must find a way to survive in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness. This causes factions to splinter and psychotic leaders to take control. Soon, violence and manipulation take over, and the group becomes tribalistic and animalistic. Betrayal and contempt are abound, causing characters to develop violent and vindictive personalities. Survival becomes the one and only goal, with many human traits being shed in service of this. Juxtaposition is the name of the game here, with the art often lulling readers into a sense of benign security before showing them something truly disturbing. Beautiful Darkness is exactly what the title implies, and I would recommend going in as blind as possible.
Kicking off at number 5, Hellblazer. We can't speak horror comic books without first referencing one of its most captivating and bad characters, the conman / demonic mage, John Constantine. In actual fact though, before his own series, Constantine peeked his head through the panels of the legendary horror comic Swamp Thing, which may or may not be on this list, first appearing in the June 1985 issue of the Saga of Swamp Thing. Listen guys, you've all got pretty awesome horror tastes, and I'm fairly certain that for those of you that haven't yet read Hellblazer, you'll gobble it up like a bloated demonic hellhound at an all-you-can-eat buffet. And if that simile went over your head, in other words, you'll really enjoy it. Hellblazer is equal parts occult detective noir, gritty fantasy, pure horror, and in several instances, incredibly hilarious deadpan humor. Also, its name is attached to some of the most legendary writers in horror history: Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Peter Milligan, the fantastic Garth Ennis, and that's only to name a few. Originally published by DC Comics but later picked up by Vertigo for its most captivating 15-year run, Hellblazer and John Constantine will literally take you to hell and back, and also literally gives Satan himself the middle finger. If that's not reason enough to enjoy Hellblazer, I'm not sure what is.
Coming in at number 4, Fatale. Fatale is a supernatural noir comic book created by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. It was published by Image Comics between January 2012 and July 2014. The series was initially announced as a 12-issue limited series, but it was later extended to 24 issues. Fatale chronicles the life of Josephine, or Jo, an archetypical femme fatale who is seemingly immortal, having survived from the 1930s to the modern day unaged, and also has a supernatural ability to hypnotize men into becoming intensely infatuated with her, whether she wants them to be or not. Through the decades, Jo struggles to understand and control her powers while being pursued by a violent cult. The cult worship cosmic gods reminiscent of Lovecraftian horrors, which are somehow tied to Jo. During her travels, Jo also encounters many men who quickly become entranced by her, often to fanatical degrees. They become entangled in her escapades, possibly as guardians, collaborators, and lovers. A motif of the series is how these men pay dearly for becoming involved with Jo. The narrative jumps back and forth between different time periods and points of view, primarily Jo and the men entranced by her. The first issue of the series sold well, with reviews being mostly positive, with comparisons to the creative team's previous work on Sleeper, Criminal, and Incognito. Coming in at 3, The Courtyard. Alan Moore's The Courtyard is a 2-issue comic book miniseries published back in 2003 by Avatar Press. The comic was adapted by Anthony Johnston with artwork by Jason Burrows from a 1994 prose story by Alan Moore. The plot concerns Aldo Sachs, an FBI agent using anomaly theory, a method that correlates seemingly unrelated data into a cohesive whole, to investigate 3 seemingly unrelated ritual murders around the United States. His investigation leads him to a nightclub in Red Hook, Brooklyn, where he hears of a psychoactive drug called Aklo, peddled by a mysterious veiled man named Johnny Carcosa. Sachs sets up a meet with Carcosa at the dealer's apartment building, where he is given a hallucinogenic white powder as a prelude to the Alco. Carcosa speaks an unknown language to Sachs, who experiences visions of spectral planes and hideous primordial creatures, while understanding the truth that Aklo is not a drug, but the language Carcosa spoke to him. The visions given to him by Aklo drive Sachs to murder his neighbor using the same modus operandi as the killers he was investigating. The original 1994 prose story first appeared in an anthology, The Starry Wisdom, a tribute to H.P. Lovecraft. The comic book adaptation was planned to appear in Alan Moore's Yuggoth Cultures and Other Growths, but it was published as a limited series by Avatar in January and February 2003. Coming in at number 2, Neonomicon. Neonomicon is a 4-issue comic book limited series written by Alan Moore again and illustrated by Jason Burrows, published by American company Avatar Press in 2010. The story is a sequel to Moore's The Courtyard and part of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. Moore later continued the sequence with his comic Providence. The plot concerns FBI agents Lampert and Brez, who visit Aldo Sachs at a psychiatric hospital where he has been detained since committing 2 murders. They are investigating a copycat killer and want to question Sachs about his motives. Moore talked about the genesis of the project in an interview with Wired magazine. I quote, "It was just at the time when I finally parted company with DC Comics over something dreadful that happened around the Watchmen film. I had a tax bill coming up and I needed some money quickly, so I happened to be talking to William A. Christensen from Avatar Press, and he suggested that he could provide some if I was up for doing a 4-part series. So I did. So although I took it to pay off the tax bill, I'm always going to make sure I try and I make it the best possible story I can." According to reports, Moore wanted to elaborate on some of the ideas presented in The Courtyard while at the same time telling a modern story that did not rely upon a 1930s atmosphere. Another idea was to use some of the elements he felt Lovecraft himself and pastiche writers censored or left out of the stories, such as the racism and sexual phobias. Moore explains, I quote, "Lovecraft was sexually squeamish, would only talk of certain nameless rituals, or he'd use some euphemism, blasphemous rites. It was pretty obvious, given that a lot of his stories detailed the inhuman offspring of these blasphemous rituals, that sex was probably involved somewhere along the line. But that never used to feature in Lovecraft's stories, except as a kind of suggested undercurrent. So I thought, let's put all of the unpleasant racial stuff back in, let's put sex back in, let's come up with some genuinely nameless rituals, let's give them a name." And finally coming in at number 1, Fall of Cthulhu. Fall of Cthulhu is a 2007 American comic book series written by Michael Allen Nelson and published by Boom Studios. The series itself was creatively influenced by the works of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, specifically the Call of Cthulhu, with the main characters of the comic finding themselves swept up in an ancient and elaborate plot designed by the dark god Nyarlathotep to provoke an apocalyptic war between powerful beings known as the Great Old Ones. Following the initial 15-issue series in June 2008, a sequel 4-issue miniseries subtitled God War began publication the following month. Fall of Cthulhu Apocalypse, a second 4-issue miniseries, ran from November 2008 to February 2009. Then, the third and final miniseries, Fall of Cthulhu Nemesis, acted as both a prequel and coda, detailing the origin of Mr. Arkham's pet cat. Hexed, a spin-off 4-issue limited series starring Lucifer, also written by Nelson and illustrated by Emma Riso, was published alongside Apocalypse. An ongoing series that ran for 12 issues, also titled Hex, was launched in August 2008.